Hi guys, today's video is going to focus on the film industry section of the component 1 exam that you guys are going to sit. Now whether you're a first year or a second year student, this video is going to apply to you because we're going to take a look through both of our film texts. The one that is set strictly for the first year, and we're going to look at the other film text that is set generally for the second year, the one that you explore in second year. So we're going to be looking at Straight Outta Compton, which is your first year text. It appears on component 1, and in AS level, that's the only film you could ever get asked about. Obviously, it's not that likely that we're going to be sitting AS levels this year because I'm teaching you from my spare bedroom here, which kind of says that this isn't really a normal year for us. Obviously, we're right in the middle of the pandemic shutdown, so I think exams are kind of not going to happen for most of us. But they will happen next year. So this video will also take place for, will also be relevant for second year or A-level students as well. We're going to look at both of our texts. So Straight Outta Compton is strictly a first year one. I, Daniel Blake, can appear in the second year text. Now this is not to say that Straight Outta Compton will not appear on the second year exam, because in second year they have more options. They can give you Straight Outta Compton or I, Daniel Blake, or neither, because exam boards can do that kind of thing. They can mess with us like that and make us learn something all year that we never get asked about in the exam. Class, right? Okay, so the way we're going to approach this is through looking at Straight Outta Compton and I, Daniel Blake. We're going to explore how risky each of these films were for the companies to make. So this is a financial, like an industry kind of question, basically, as to how risky they were financially for our companies to make. Now, what I'm going to argue today is that actually neither is that risky to make, but the reasons why each one is not that risky vary from text to text. So Straight Outta Compton is the one we're going to look at first. Now, Straight Outta Compton was directed by a guy called F. Gary Gray, and it is a film about, well, firstly, the genre, it's a biopic, which means it's based on real events and based on real people. Now, the real events and real people it's based on are a hip-hop band, one of the first pioneering gangster rap bands called NWA. I won't tell you what NWA stands for because I'm white, so I can't say that word, but you can go and Google what it stands for if you want to, for extra context. Now, it's based on real events, but obviously it's a slightly biased text, right? So Straight Outta Compton are NWA are a complicated bunch of people. One of them, for example, was a drug dealer. They used to play around with weapons quite a lot. They were involved in a lot of kind of shady underworld stuff and were quite kind of violent. Dre had a very infamous run-in with a female reporter where he basically beat her up while his bodyguard protected Dre from anyone kind of intervening, because he had his gun out and was stopping people getting involved in that fight and separating that, well, not fight, beating, I guess. So the thing about Straight Outta Compton is it's quite biased, so it shows them in a very positive light, and the reasons why this takes place, or the reasons why it's so positive, will become apparent later on when we look at who actually produced this thing. Now, before we get into this, with NWA, we need to be aware that there is both a film called Straight Outta Compton and an album called Straight Outta Compton. Now, the album is one of the key reasons why this was not a particularly risky production. So, if we look at Straight Outta Compton, the album, it sold 3 million copies. That means it's gone triple platinum. So it's an absolutely giant record, right? There are 3 million people out there who own that record on CD. There are millions others who actually just stream it and listen to it, like, separately from buying an album. Now, what that means for us is that there is a pre-sold audience. So there's my cat in the background. This may interrupt the video. And I'm back. So what this means for us is that there are 3 million people out there who basically own this album, right? And we can assume that if they've spent money to buy a CD, then they are going to be fans of NWA. Now, what this means is that when the film is released almost 30 years later after the album was released, there are still 3 million people out there who are what we call a pre-sold audience in media studies. A pre-sold audience, I would write that bit down. So we have massive pre-sold audiences who straight away are like a captive audience who are potentially going to want to go and see this film, which straight away should be suggesting to us that it's not that risky. If you know you've got an audience out there, then it's much less risky to produce a film, knowing that people already exist out there who are going to be fans of the content. So it's not just the pre-sold audiences as well of the band NWA. Each one of them guys, each one of the members of the band is now like a huge celebrity in their own right. Maybe not DJ Yella and MC Ren, but Ice Cube and Dr. Dre are still absolutely massive celebrities in their own right. Dre is one of the biggest hip-hop producers on the planet, if not the biggest. He's the first hip-hop billionaire, right? So he's got a huge pre-sold audience. There are artists out there who wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Dre. People like Kendrick Lamar, 50 Cent, Eminem. These artists would not exist if it wasn't for Dre. So he's a huge producer with a massive following. Ice Cube has had a very successful career in both the music industry and the film industry. So he's written quite a lot of big, famous films. Boys in the Hood is one of his biggest, most famous films that he both wrote and appeared in. I think he was definitely in Friday. I don't know if he wrote Friday. In fact, he did write Friday. He wrote Friday as well. So that's another massive film that he was responsible for. He's had lots of success in terms of the albums he's released afterwards, as have Dre in their post NWA lives. So these guys have pre-sold audiences too. And again, this is another reason why it's not that risky, because we've got the whole group NWA, and then we've got Dre and Cube. So that's three massive fan bases all being targeted. One of the main reasons why this wasn't a particularly risky production comes down to who actually produced this thing and who actually made it and who was involved in the funding of the whole thing, if we look at it from an audience perspective. And I believe here is my little boy. Hello.
I want some quavers.
You want some quavers? And I'm back again. Cats and kids interrupting this whole teaching from home thing again. So if we look at the companies who are involved in actually kind of funding the film and distributing the film and producing the film, again, we can see that Straight Outta Compton was not a particularly risky venture, right? So Straight Outta Compton was, and this is where you need to write some more stuff down, Straight Outta Compton was produced by a company called Legendary Pictures. So what that means is they got the money together, they got the production company, they got the basic cameramen and directors and actors and all that together, and actually made the film, right? This was all done by a company called Legendary Pictures. Here's the confusing part. So Legendary Pictures are what we call a subsidiary of a parent company, and their parent company is the company that owns Legendary Pictures, is a massive conglomerate, a Chinese conglomerate called the Wanda Group. That's WANDA, Wanda Group. And the Wanda Group, I'm going to have to check my notes here because I wrote it down because I knew I'd forget this figure. But last year, the Wanda Group made, right, this is just earnings for 1 year, $35 billion. So they're an absolute giant conglomerate. They just make money left, right, and centre. There is absolutely no chance on this planet that the Wanda Group could ever go bust, no matter what happens. They're too rich. It just can't happen, right? Now, they own Legendary Pictures, and what they did was they took $28 million and gave it to Legendary Pictures to go and make this film. Now, if you think about $35 billion and $28 million, there is not, like, 28 million is nothing. That's like a fraction of a percent. In terms of their overall money, they'd make that back in interest within a day. So they're not going to lose any money at all by putting 28 million into the production of this film. What they do though is they ensure further success of the film by putting 28 million into it. So if we think about how $28 million in terms of production budget can actually ensure success, just think about how good the movie's going to look with $28 million behind it. You can afford to hire the best directors and the best actors and the best camera crew, and you can afford to make like all these CGI effects and hire loads of extras and massive. I mean, think about the scene in Straight Outta Compton where it's in a concert hall and they recreate NWA concerts. That thing must have cost a fortune, but it looks absolutely amazing, right? So all of this stuff put together ensures what we call, write this down, high production values. Don't have a drink while you write that down. High production values. Should have written that down by now. So these high production values basically mean that the film looks mint and it sounds mint, and it does, right? It's a really entertaining film. So all of this helps ensure further success. People want to go and see good, flashy, big films. That's why the Avengers series has done so well. That's why Marvel do so well. Big, flashy, spectacle films, okay? On the other side of that, the distribution company were also a massive factor in the success of the whole film. So the distribution company was a company called Universal. Now you should have heard of Universal. It's one of the big 6 media companies. So Universal Studios distributed it, and what that means is they had nothing to do with the production of the whole thing. They didn't kind of influence how the film was going to be or what happens in the film or anything like that. What it means is once the film was made, they were in charge of actually marketing the thing and getting it out to audiences and all that kind of stuff. Now, Universal is also a subsidiary, which means there's a big company that owns it. And the big company that owns Universal is called Comcast. Nearly forgot there. Comcast. Now, again, I'm going to check my notes, but last year, Comcast, in just profit alone, made $22.7 billion. Again, an absolute titan of a company. It's never going to lose its money, right? So what that means is that they can afford to basically pump as much money into the distribution as they want to, really. So they ended up putting in $22 million into just marketing and distributing the film. So just marketing alone is $22 million. Like, you will never, if we put all of our money together, we will never make that much money in our lifetime between us, right? So that $22 million means that basically they could do what is called, again, write this down, saturation marketing, which means that around the entire globe where this film was released, there was marketing materials for it. So if we think about the types of marketing materials that we've seen red band trailers, we've seen green band trailers, so trailers that are suitable for all audiences, trailers that are suitable for older audiences. We've seen TV spots, which means like adverts on the TV. We've seen billboards and we've seen poster campaigns. Think about how much, how many posters you would have to make to get them in every planet. Every planet, every country on the planet, in order to market this thing. It's absolutely astronomical, right? And here's the beauty of it: if your film doesn't do well, and you're a massive conglomerately owned media distribution company, all that you would have to do is pump more money into it and do more marketing and more marketing and more marketing until basically this thing becomes successful. It's that easy, right? So when there's huge money behind it, it's easy to get successful films. Now, this is worth $50 million. This film is a $50 million film. When we take the $28 million production and the $22 million distribution, it's $50 million. So a huge film, and it was successful. So it made $200 million back. That's a giant film, okay? It did really, really well. To make 4 times back what it cost, great. A lot of films these days just try and break even if you're not a massively successful kind of film company. You're just trying to break even when you make films. To make 4 times of what it cost is great. Really, really good film there. And it wasn't just money that was produced by the film itself. There was money being made left, right, and centre, and this is where industry structure comes into it. So we've talked about David Hesmanhaldge before. I'm not going to draw him this time because I drew him last time, and I'm sure you can all remember the image that I drew because it's burned in my memory, right? But David Hesmanhaldge talks about industrial formatting, right, which is both horizontal and vertical integration. In my class, we're aware of what vertical and horizontal integration is. I'm not going to go back over that here, but if you get stuck, please go away and Google it. There's loads of stuff out there that tells you what these are. But if we look at how our parent companies, Comcast, kind of operate, right, there's money being made left, right, and centre. Don't forget that Straight Outta Compton was also an album, right? So we've got Universal Studios who are distributing this thing. I would draw this as a map here. We've got Universal Studios we've got Comcast at the top. Let's put Comcast at the top, who own Universal Studios. Now, Universal Studios also owns a company called Universal Music Group. Guess what they do? They do all the music of Universal Music Group. Now, Universal Music Group, sorry, I've written this down here, owns a company called Interscope Records, and Interscope Records owns a company called Death Row Records, and Death Row Records, here we go, this is the long chain here, Death Row Records owns all of Dre's music, basically. And Dre owned Death Row Records for a long time. Now, what that means is when this film is released, It's going to do really well. It's going to indirectly market Dre, and then people are going to go and buy Dre's music or listen to Dre's music, and that money filters back through to Death Row Records, which goes up to Interscope, which goes up to Universal, which goes all the way back up to Comcast. So it's like a chain in the music production, right? It's nice and simple that way. If we look at one of the other producers of the film, which is Tamika Woods Wright, who's Eazy-E's widow. She owns a company called Compton Records, which owns the original Straight Outta Compton album. This is where it gets confusing. You might need to watch the video a few times here to get this down. I'm also reading my notes because it's so confusing. But Tamika Woods Wright owns Compton Records, which is also owned by Interscope Records, which goes all the way back up the chain again. So it's making money for producers like that through that kind of like stepped ownership. At the time the film was released, Dre released, so Dre still owned Beats by Dre. And this is like a big headphones company, basically a huge headphones company that makes basically like cans that you put on your heads, and like you know what Beats are. You're like 16, right? So this means that when Dre was kind of releasing this film that he'd produced, he also then released Beats by Dre that had Straight Outta Compton written across them. And these things retailed at $600. Now, a lot of people will have gone and bought these things, and again, it's just more money for the producers. So there's money being made left, right, and centre. Now, all of these companies working together, there's a proper term for this. Write this down. It's called synergy. And this is where two companies work together for mutual benefit. So Beats by Dre is a separate company from Legendary and Universal, but they all benefit each other by the release of this film. Dre released his newest album, his first album in 14 years, which was called Compton, a Soundtrack, which was clearly a reference to the Straight Outta Compton film that was just coming out, because he knew that by the film coming out, you would get synergy between the film and Dre's new record, Compton, a Soundtrack. So you have further synergy there. And again, more money's being made, more and more money's being made. And this is all just ways in which this film is becoming successful. Now, to top all this off, there are two bits of theory here that we need to go over really quickly that further explain how this film was always going to be successful. One of them is something called two-step flow, which is a theory by Paul Lazarsfeld, which is an amazing name. It's basically like Laserfield, but with an S in between. So Lazarsfeld, Lasersfield, however you want to pronounce it, right? But two-step flow is a theory we've covered a few times in class. And this is the idea that people who hold a lot of influence in society spread their opinions to their followers, and then they spread them to their followers, and it's called two-step flow. So you get a media text here, and then you get like what's called an opinion leader, and they pass that opinion down to audiences. How that works in terms of Straight Outta Compton is to do with like an app that was released called Straight Outta Somewhere. Go and Google it, right? There's some amazing results that show off what Straight Outta Somewhere was. Initially, it was intended to be kind of like an app where you could put, like, you know, the Straight Outta Compton thing, you could put yourself in there. So I could put like Straight Outta Bede College and like a picture of me behind it in black and white, and then I'd share it, and then my like 40 Twitter followers would see it and be like, oh yeah, there's a new film come out. But a lot of celebrities got involved in this. So like I said at the start of the video, Dre is responsible for the careers of people like 50 Cent and Eminem and Kendrick Lamar, and each one of them made a Straight Outta Somewhere thing and shared it with their Twitter followers and their Facebook followers and Instagram followers, and this exploded the marketing for this film, the distribution for this film. So the Straight Outta Somewhere app basically gave free advertising to this film. So if you're a massive fan of Eminem and he says like he's straight out of Detroit, I think he's from, if he posts like a Straight Outta Detroit thing, you straight away going to go, hang on, what's this? And then that's his endorsement of this film anyway, and it's a further way to market the film. So it's really successful in that respect. So a two-step flow further ensured success of the film. On top of that, we just have to face the fact that actually Straight Outta Compton is not a particularly original film. It's a good film, but it's not particularly original. There are lots and lots of biopics out there. Think about, just in the last few years, huge biopics that have come out. Bohemian Rhapsody about Queen, Rocket Man about, what's his face? Elton John. There's another biopic coming out by the director of Joker about Hulk Hogan, right? And it's going to be the same as all these things. It's not going to be a music one. I hope to God it's about wrestling and not a music thing. But all of these things are huge kind of biopics, and they all follow the same format. We look at like these acts just before they were famous, and then we follow their careers through the problems they have, and ultimately they have happy endings. That's how biopics work, basically, right? Now, we know through looking at Curran and Seaton, who are two theorists that, again, I would make notes of now, we know through looking at Curran and Seaton, they've said that the biggest media conglomerates are driven by profit and power. And when we have companies that are driven by profit and power, we don't generally get massively original films. If you want original films, you generally don't focus on making profit, right? Because original feeling films don't generally make a lot of profit. Go and Google Harmony Korrine's Fantastic Trash Humpers, for example. That film did not make any money because it's nuts. But it is very, very original. Straight Outta Compton is not original at all, and therefore there's more chance of it making money that way because it's unoriginal. And audiences don't like to be too challenged. We like certain patterns, we like the pleasure of recognition, and so you're likely to get people going to watch it if it's unoriginal. So that was a long take on why Straight Outta Compton was always going to be successful, and there are other reasons. Okay, I couldn't possibly go into them all now, but there are other reasons why Straight Outta Compton was always going to be successful. So yeah, moving on from this, we have I, Daniel Blake. Now, if you're in first year, if you're an AS student, there's a potential that you haven't seen I, Daniel Blake. If you haven't, what I suggest you do now is pause this video and go and watch the trailer for I, Daniel Blake. I'll wait. So I, Daniel Blake is quite an original film, right? It's directed by a guy called Ken Loach. And Ken Loach works in a genre, write this down, called social realism. So he makes social realist films. And social realist films are basically films that hold a mirror up to society and say, this is what's going wrong in society right now. There's a lot of conventions about social realism. So if we look at like Stephen Neal's Repetition and Difference, the repetition is all there for you to see. If you go and Google a film like Shane Meadows' This Is England, you'll see a lot of comparisons between I, Daniel Blake and This Is England. So they're generally set in the north of England. They generally focus on working class families. They generally focus on kind of how the government is screwing people over and making life hard for the working man, which they do a lot of the time. And there's a lot of they're quite grey films, they're quite gritty films. They don't necessarily have happy endings, all that kind of stuff, right? So a lot of them there's a lot of conventions there. Ken Loach is really famous from all the way in the 1960s, making social realist films over and over again. And I, Daniel Blake has been arguably his most successful film in terms of its financial and its critical response, right? So I, Daniel Blake focuses on a guy called Daniel Blake. Surprise, surprise. And Daniel Blake is a carpenter who gets laid off after he's had a heart attack, and then he has to focus on trying to negotiate the universal credit system, right? So he has to try and basically claim benefits. And it's kind of about how the system is failing and how people are kind of losing homes and losing their livelihoods through this new system. So I, Daniel Blake's context is actually quite a complex one, and there's a lot of videos online that explain this better than I can. And what I'll do is I'll post like a link to the metadata. I'll post some links in the metadata that show off kind of the context around I, Daniel Blake. But in a nutshell, what's happened is in 2008 there was a financial crisis, a financial crash rather, across the globe that saw a lot of people losing houses, a lot of like banks almost going bust, and then the taxpayer basically bailed them out, right, which has left the country in a massive debt. Now, what happened in 2010 was the Conservative government were voted in, and in that time, they've been responsible for something called Austerity Measures. Now, Austerity Measures is basically where you cut public funding and you cut a lot of what the country was kind of spending money on before, and you try and take all that back so you can save some money. Ken Loach is very critical of the Conservative government and has made this film as a response to what they've been doing, basically, as a reply to what David Cameron and Boris Johnson and Theresa May have all been kind of doing in their time in power. So it's all about that. It's a rally against the government, basically. Now, in a nutshell, we can argue that I, Daniel Blake, is also not a particularly risky film from a financial perspective. Now, at this stage, we need to stop and start thinking about success and what the term success means, because I'm going to be using it quite a lot in the next part of the video. Now, success comes in two forms when we think about films, right? It comes in the financial form, which means how much money it made in relation to the money was put into it. So you have a cost and income ratio. So if you pay £3.5 million to make I, Daniel Blake, and it makes £15 million back, which is true, it's a financially successful film. But there's another type of success called critical success. And a lot of time, British film is not made for financial success, and this is the case with I, Daniel Blake. It's made to try and garner critical success. And what that means is you win awards, your film has a general message that gets discussed, and all that kind of stuff. And I, Daniel Blake, got success in both of them cases. Now, it was critically successful because it won a huge award, right? So every year there's something called the Cannes Film Festival. Actually, probably not going to happen this year, first time in ages. But there's something called the Cannes Film Festival, and it's in a place called Cannes in France, right? Now, this thing has like a best film award, basically, and it's a very artistic kind of award. It's like an Oscar, but it's often deemed more kind of artistic and more critically kind of, I don't know, valuable. I don't think that's the right word, but more critically acclaimed, I guess. And this award's called the Palme d'Or. I really need to write these down somewhere because these are complicated terms and they're French terms, right? So, here we go. So, we have... Hold up, the Cannes Film Festival, and we have the Palme d'Or Award. Ta-da! There you go, Cannes Film Festival and the Palme d'Or Award. And what that is basically like the best film, and some amazing films have won the Palme d'Or. The first one that comes to my head, Pulp Fiction, has won the Palme d'Or award, right? So I, Daniel Blake, won this, and it did fantastically well off the back of winning this. It's on a lot of the marketing material to say that, I can stay in my hands now, to say that the film is massively critically acclaimed, right? But it also did financially well. But here's the thing with I, Daniel Blake. The way it was funded, it was never intended to do well financially, because it didn't have to do well financially. I, Daniel Blake is funded by something called the British Film Institute, or the BFI. Now, the BFI is basically where a lot of funding for British film excuse me, a lot of funding for British film comes from. I hope that's not coronavirus. So, every year, the BFI is given money by the National Lottery. You know, when you play the lottery, a lot of that money goes to charitable organisations. It doesn't all go back into prizes, right? So, the lottery gives £15 million a year to the British Film Institute. And what they do is they divvy out that £15 million a year to different filmmakers to go and make films that they think are going to be successful. Not financially, but successful culturally. Now, what that means is the British Film Institute looked at I, Daniel Blake, and decided to give Ken Loach and his production company called 16 Films £3.5 million. So that's more than a fifth of their overall yearly budget went into I, Daniel Blake to make this film, right? The nice thing about it is because it's a charitable organisation, they don't ever expect any of this money back. So they were just given £3.5 million to go and make a film. If it succeeds, it succeeds. If it doesn't, it doesn't. No one's going to go knocking on Ken Loach's door and breaking his legs when this thing doesn't make any money, right? The other bit of funding, because it didn't all come from the BFI, but another bit of the funding came from the BBC. And as we know, the BBC is funded by the taxpayer, right? By the licence fee, basically. Again, the BBC is not for profit. They never intended for this film to make money. Now, if we think about how that works, that means that 16 Films and a French company called Why Not Productions and who co-produced this film, and the BFI and the BBC were never trying to make money. They weren't chasing profit and power. So if we look at Curran and Seaton's work, what this means basically is that they could make a film that was entirely original, Remember, original films don't generally make a lot of money. Now, this film is based on a middle-aged man, a middle-aged carpenter from Newcastle upon Tyne, who loses his job and then has to apply for benefits and meets a lady from London who's just been kicked out of a house because of social housing problems in London, and they form an unlikely friendship, and Daniel Blake basically tries to teach them how to cope with no money. If that's not an original film, I don't know what is. Well, I do know what is. Trash Humpers is obviously an original film, but this is the next best thing to Trash Humpers, right? So here's the original film, never intended to make money. It just so happens that I, Daniel Blake, absolutely exploded, right? When it got released. It was a hugely successful film critically. So it got loads of 5-star reviews by all these big film kind of reviewing companies and stuff. The big thing about this is that politicians started to talk about it. So the Labour Party was really behind I, Daniel Blake. They would raise it. They would talk about it in Parliament and say, like, the Conservative government needs to go away and look at the benefit system, because if you go watch I, Daniel Blake, it gives a clear picture of what's going on in our country. So just having that means that it then appears in newspapers. And appears on the news, and it goes into the public consciousness, and that is like two-step floor. That's indirect free marketing for the film. Other ways that the film becomes successful is a lot of the left-wing media, because Ken Loach made a left-wing film, because he is left-wing, so I, Daniel Blake, is very left-wing. The left-wing media got hold of this. So the Mirror did this thing. They worked with I, Daniel Blake, and 16 Films and Why Not Productions and all of these production companies that were involved in making it. They gave away 10,000 free cinema tickets with copies of the Mirror. They also had Ken Loach talk about the film on the in their newspaper as well, and they also had an article written by the character Daniel Blake, explaining kind of his problems with the benefit system and stuff. Now, he's a fictional character, obviously, he's not a real person, but they had him write an article, and again, this helps promote the film. Now, the producers of I, Daniel Blake also helped keep costs down, and this helped reduce any financial risk. Not that there was any financial risk, but they helped keep the costs down, right? So they did this by shooting everything on location. So everywhere in the film is a real place, right? It's not like they've built sets just for making this film. It's shot in real houses. It's shot in a real food bank. It's shot in a real job centre. All of these places are real, right? And the other thing that's real about it is a lot of the actors are volunteers. So the ladies in the food bank, in that scene in the food bank, if you've seen the film, that is all real people who work in the food bank. The lady in the job centre, she actually works in a job centre. So these actors were not being paid. They're all volunteers to help kind of make the film more realistic and cheaper, actually. So the whole thing's cheaper. Now, another clever bit of marketing comes down to something called, another clever bit of marketing was one of the companies who was involved in it, right? So they kept costs down through working with a company called Commando Marketing. Now, that's Commando with a K, right? So Commando Marketing. And what they do is they produce experimental marketing campaigns. Now, if you watch I, Daniel Blake, there is a letter that he writes. I won't spoil it for you, but you need to read the letter, basically, or go just watch the film. When we get back to college, we're going to watch the film. But this letter was fed into a projector and projected on the side of the Houses of Parliament, right? So they took a big projector and shone the image of the letter on the side of the House of Parliament. And this again generates two-step flow, because people were taking pictures, they were sharing the hashtag #IDanielBlake when they were taking pictures of it, and again it was free marketing, it was free exposure for it. There was further kind of clever marketing when we look at the exhibition stage of the film. Now, we've talked about production and we talked about distribution, but we've not talked about exhibition yet. So you need to make a note of this. The exhibition is where the film is actually shown. And how they did this was they took the film I, Daniel Blake, and they went into the places it was shot. So they would go and knock on the doors of all the people in tower blocks where the film was shot, and they would say, we're going to be showing I, Daniel Blake on Saturday. Would you like to come and watch it? We're going to show it in the courtyard of the tower block that you live in. Obviously, people were like, yeah, because it's a free movie you can go and see. And then when they rocked up to watch the film, Ken Loach would be there. Jeremy Corbyn, who was the Labour Party leader at the time, also went and attended quite a lot of these screenings, did talks at the start of it, criticising the Conservative government, and then they showed the film, right? And this again stirs up kind of like social media activity around the film, stirs up people's conversation around the film, and gets the film better known. Now, all of this ended up making this film fantastically successful. So it cost £3.5 million to make, and it made £15 million back as of today. So for an independent film about a guy trying to claim job seekers allowance, that's pretty crazy, right? That's a huge, huge success for I, Daniel Blake. Now, both of our films are significantly different. So Straight Outta Compton is a massive, profit-driven Hollywood blockbuster film. I, Daniel Blake is a niche, social realist British film, but they both were successful, and neither was risky. Straight Outta Compton wasn't risky because it was nice and secure in terms of like all the cultural and industrial formatting that had gone around it. Check out Hesmond Alger's theory for that one. And I, Daniel Blake was successful because it was never it didn't have to make money. It was more about getting a message out there rather than making profit. It just so happened that it did make profit too. So both of these films were massively successful. Now, you'll have a task to do this afternoon, so I will share that with you. I'm not going to say it here because I always end up setting different tasks to what I say here. So I'll type out the task for you guys on Teams so you can have a look at what you need to do this afternoon. If anyone has any questions, I'm around quite a lot, so please just send me some messages on Teams, and just make sure you all stay safe out there, guys, and I'll see you when I see you.